26th of April 1999. It's a bright spring morning in West London, the sort of day that feels ordinary, the sort of day that nobody remembers, until something happens that changes everything. In the affluent streets of Fulham, people are going about their lives. Cars move slowly through residential roads. Neighbours tend to gardens. Front doors open and close. Nothing seems unusual. At around 11:30 in the morning, a blue BMW pulls into Gowan Avenue. Behind the wheel is one of the most recognisable women in Britain. A woman whose face has become a familiar part of millions of homes. A woman trusted by the public. A woman who in just a few minutes will be dead. Jill Dando parks outside her house. She gathers a few things from the car and walks towards her front door. There is no sign of panic, no sign of fear, no indication that anything is wrong. If somebody is watching her, she doesn't know it. If somebody has been waiting for her, she has no reason to suspect it. She reaches the front gate, walks up the path, and places her key into the lock. What happens next takes only seconds. A single gunshot cracks through the quiet street. Neighbours hear the sound. Some later think it's a car backfiring. Others aren't sure what they've heard at all. The noise is over, almost as soon as it begins. But for Jill Dando, everything is over. She collapses outside her own front door, shot once in the head at extremely close range. No robbery, no struggle, no warning, just one shot, and then silence. The killer disappears. No dramatic chase. No eyewitness who can identify them. No weapon left behind. No obvious motive. Only questions. Questions that would consume detectives for years. Questions that would dominate headlines. Questions that would ultimately lead to one of the most controversial murder investigations in British history. Because this wasn't just any victim. This was Jill Dando, a presenter known and trusted across the United Kingdom, a woman who seemed to have no enemies, a woman whose murder made no sense. As news of the shooting spreads, shock turns into disbelief. How could somebody this famous be executed in broad daylight on a London street? Who would want her dead? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if somebody could do this to Jill Dando, could they simply disappear without a trace? Over the years, investigators would chase countless leads: a lone obsessive, a professional assassin, a criminal seeking revenge, even theories involving international politics and foreign intelligence services. One man would be arrested, one man would be convicted, one man would spend years behind bars for the crime, and then that conviction would collapse, leaving Britain right back where it started, with a murder, a victim, and no proven killer. Tonight we retrace every step, the facts, the failures, the theories, and the mystery that refuses to die. Because more than 2 decades later, one question still hangs over Gowan Avenue. Who killed Jill Dando? Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm your host, Matt. If you'd like to support the show, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. You can also find us on all the socials at What They Hide Pod. You can also email the show at whattheyhidepod@gmail.com. If you'd like to share your thoughts on today's episode, get in touch, or even suggest a case. And as always, if you enjoy the podcast, please consider following, rating and sharing it. It genuinely helps more people discover the show and allows me to keep bringing you these stories. Before we begin, this episode contains discussions of murder, violent crime and themes that some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Now, this is the story of Jill Dando. Let's crack on with the show. By the spring of 1999, Jill Dando had become one of the most familiar faces on British television. Millions of people knew her voice before they saw her face. She appeared in living rooms across the country, presenting news bulletins, fronting popular television programmes, and perhaps most famously, helping to bring unsolved crimes to national attention through Crimewatch. It was a remarkable rise for someone whose public image remained so grounded. Friends and colleagues often described her as warm, professional, and remarkably unchanged by fame. While celebrity culture was becoming increasingly aggressive during the 1990s, Jill seemed to occupy a different space. She was widely respected, rather than controversial, trusted, rather than divisive. Born in Weston-super-Mare in 1961, Jill began her career in local journalism before moving into television. The route wasn't glamorous. There were no overnight success stories or lucky breaks that instantly transformed her into a household name. Instead, her career developed steadily through hard work, experience, and a reputation for reliability. By the late 1980s, she was working for the BBC. The opportunities continued to grow. Viewers saw her presenting national news programmes. She became a familiar face on Holiday and other BBC productions. Then came Crimewatch, the programme that would become closely associated with her name. The concept was simple but powerful. Police forces from around the country would appeal directly to the public for help solving serious crimes. Reconstructions were broadcast to millions of viewers, and information often flooded in after transmission. Crimewatch wasn't just entertainment. Families watched in the hope that a loved one's killer might finally be identified. Victims' relatives often saw the programme as one last chance to generate leads. For many viewers, Jill became the reassuring face guiding them through some of the darkest stories in the country. Away from television, life appeared equally positive. In early 1999, she was engaged to consultant gynecologist Alan Farthing. Friends later recalled how happy she seemed. Plans for the future were beginning to take shape. Marriage was being discussed. Career opportunities continued to arrive. From the outside, everything suggested a woman entering one of the happiest periods of her life. There was no public scandal, no obvious enemies, no known threats hanging over her. Nothing that hinted at the events that were about to unfold. That sense of normality would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. When detectives later searched for a motive, they immediately encountered a problem. Murder investigations usually begin with relationships, disputes, money, jealousy, revenge or personal grudges. The closer investigators looked at Jill Dando's life, the harder it became to find anything that resembled a traditional motive. Instead, they found a successful television presenter preparing for the next chapter of her life. On the evening before her death, she spent time with family. There was nothing unusual about her plans for the following day, nothing to suggest she felt afraid, nothing to indicate she believed she was in danger. Monday the 26th of April began much like countless other days. People across Britain headed to work, children went to school, commuters packed trains and buses. In West London, Jill Dando got on with her day. But by lunchtime, the country would be in shock. And before detectives could begin searching for a killer, they would first have to answer a much simpler question. What exactly happened on Gowan Avenue? On Monday the 26th of April 1999, the weather in London was mild. It was the kind of spring day that blends into countless others, leaving little trace in memory. For most people, it would pass without incident. For detectives, who would later work the case, every minute of that morning would become important. Jill Dando had spent part of the day carrying out ordinary errands. There was nothing remarkable about her movements, no reports of arguments, no sign she was distressed, no indication that she was concerned for her safety. At some point, before midday, she drove back to her home on Gowan Avenue in Fulham. Gowan Avenue was not the sort of place people associated with violent crime, a quiet residential street lined with attractive homes. It sat in one of London's more desirable areas. Residents came and went. Cars were parked neatly along the road. Life moved at a comfortable pace. Nothing about the setting suggested it was about to become the centre of one of Britain's most infamous murder investigations. Jill parked her blue BMW near her house. Investigators would later piece together her final movements from witness statements, forensic evidence and the position in which she was found. The picture that emerged was chillingly brief. She left her vehicle and walked towards her front gate. In one hand she carried items from the car. She moved along the short path leading to her front door. Then she stopped at the entrance and began unlocking it. At that moment, somebody was either already nearby or approached with extraordinary timing. The attack happened so quickly that investigators have long believed Jill may never have fully registered the danger. There was no evidence of a prolonged confrontation, no indication of a struggle, no signs that she attempted to run. The gunman came close, very close. A single shot was fired. The bullet struck Jill in the head behind her left ear. Death was almost instantaneous. The killer did not fire a second round. There was no need. Within seconds, the attacker was gone, and that is where the mystery truly begins. Because despite the violence of what had just happened, remarkably little evidence appeared to have been left behind. No murder weapon, no obvious forensic trail, no clear eyewitness who could confidently identify the killer. No immediate explanation for why one of the most recognisable people in Britain had been shot dead on her own doorstep. Neighbours heard the gunshot. Some initially mistook it for something else. A car backfiring, a loud bang, a noise unusual enough to notice, but not unusual enough to trigger alarm. By the time anyone realised what had happened, the attacker had vanished. A neighbour soon discovered Jill collapsed outside the house. Emergency services were called. Paramedics rushed to the scene. Despite their efforts, there was nothing they could do. News of the shooting spread rapidly through police channels. Before long, senior officers were heading towards Fulham. Then came the moment when the wider public began to learn what had happened. Television networks interrupted schedules. Radio stations carried updates. Journalists scrambled to verify reports that one of the BBC's most famous presenters had been shot. For many people, the story seemed impossible. A murder like this belonged in a television drama, not on a suburban London street in broad daylight. As forensic teams began examining the scene, several aspects immediately stood out. Nothing had been taken, her jewellery remained, her handbag was still there, valuables had not been touched, robbery appeared highly unlikely. That single observation dramatically altered the direction of the investigation. If the motive wasn't theft, then what was it? The answer seemed to point towards something far more troubling. Whoever pulled the trigger had not come for money. They'd come for Jill Dando. Investigators also focused on the manner of the killing itself. One shot, close range, fast execution, swift escape. Many experienced detectives felt there was something unusually controlled about the attack. Over the years, some would privately compare it to a professional assassination. Others disagreed, arguing that appearances can be deceptive and that lone offenders are sometimes capable of carrying out crimes that look far more sophisticated than they really are. That debate continues to this day. And it's important to remember something throughout this episode. The image of a professional hitman is often more appealing than reality. Sometimes crimes that appear meticulously planned are later revealed to be chaotic. Sometimes crimes that look chaotic turn out to have been planned for months. Separating fact from assumption became one of the greatest challenges facing the investigation. Yet there was one question detectives could not escape. If this had been a targeted killing, why target Jill Dando? The answer wasn't waiting at the crime scene. It wasn't hidden inside her home. It wasn't sitting in her bank accounts or personal records. To find it, investigators would have to dig through every corner of her life. and as Britain watched in disbelief, one of the largest murder inquiries in Metropolitan Police history was about to begin. The murder of Jill Dando generated a level of public attention few investigations ever experience. Within hours, detectives were under enormous pressure. The victim was known across the country, and everyone wanted answers. The media, politicians, the public, and most importantly, Jill's family. The Metropolitan Police launched what would become one of the largest murder investigations in modern British history. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case. Thousands of statements would eventually be taken. Every aspect of Jill's life was placed under a microscope. Detectives began with the most basic questions. Who knew her? Who had access to her? Who might have wanted to harm her? The problem was that Jill Dando didn't fit the profile investigators usually encounter in murder cases. There was no bitter former partner, no obvious feud, no business dispute, no criminal connections, no immediate suspect emerging from her personal life. As officers worked through friends, family, colleagues and acquaintances, they kept reaching the same conclusion. Nobody could identify a person who stood out. Nobody could explain why someone would want her dead. The lack of an obvious motive was becoming one of the case's greatest mysteries. Meanwhile, the public response was overwhelming. The investigation was flooded with information. Some of it was useful, much of it was not. Witnesses reported suspicious people, others recalled unusual vehicles. Some were convinced they had seen the killer. Others claimed to have information about conspiracies. Thousands of calls poured in. Each had to be assessed and investigated. The challenge for detectives was separating genuine leads from noise. Some witnesses described a man seen near Gowan Avenue around the time of the shooting. The descriptions varied. Different ages, different clothing, different appearances. Like many major investigations, memories began to shift as media coverage intensified. People who had barely noticed something suddenly wondered whether what they had seen might be important. Detectives followed every promising lead. They traced vehicles. They examined CCTV where available. They reconstructed Jill's movements. They built timelines. Still, the killer remained unidentified. As days turned into weeks, speculation filled the vacuum left by the lack of answers. One theory centred on Jill's work with Crimewatch. Could a dangerous criminal have held a grudge? Could somebody featured on the programme have blamed her for their arrest? It was an idea that immediately captured the public imagination. After all, Crimewatch dealt with some of Britain's most serious offenders. The theory seemed plausible, but detectives needed evidence, not plausibility. Another line of inquiry focused on Jill's public profile. Fame brings admiration. Sometimes it also attracts obsession. Investigators examined letters, communications, and reports involving members of the public who had shown unusual interest in her over the years. Again, possibilities emerged. Nothing concrete followed. Then there were the more exotic theories. Stories involving organised crime, stories involving foreign governments, stories involving shadowy figures operating behind the scenes. At this stage, however, investigators remained focused on something much simpler: finding the person who had pulled the trigger. Weeks passed, then months. The murder remained unsolved. Despite the scale of the inquiry, the resources deployed, and the intense public attention, detectives still lacked the one thing they needed most: a credible suspect. For many watching from the outside, it was becoming increasingly difficult to imagine the case would ever be solved. Then, more than a year after Jill Dando's death, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Detectives identified a man living just a short distance from the murder scene, a man with a history of unusual behaviour, a man who would soon find himself at the centre of one of the most controversial criminal cases in British history. His name was Barry George. When Barry George's name first appeared on the investigation's radar, he didn't fit the image many people had in mind of a calculated assassin. He wasn't a career criminal. He wasn't connected to organised crime. He wasn't known as a violent offender. What detectives found instead was a man living a complicated and often chaotic life. Barry George was born in 1960 and had spent much of his adult life on the fringes of society. He had struggled to hold down employment and had a history of unusual behaviour that frequently brought him to the attention of authorities. He had also developed an obsession with celebrities. Over the years he had claimed connections to famous people, exaggerated aspects of his own life, and according to reports, sometimes presented himself as something he wasn't. At various points he reportedly told stories about working in intelligence and having military experience. None of these claims stood up to scrutiny. To some observers he appeared eccentric, to others he appeared vulnerable. What nobody could agree on was whether he was capable of carrying out a murder as precise and shocking as the one that had taken place on Gowan Avenue. Initially, Barry George was just one name among many, but as the investigation continued, detectives began taking a closer look. He lived relatively near the murder scene. Witness accounts were examined, his movements were scrutinised, his background was investigated in detail. As pressure mounted to solve the case, the focus increasingly narrowed. Then came the discovery that would become the centrepiece of the prosecution case. During searches connected to the investigation, forensic scientists examined clothing belonging to Barry George. Inside the pocket of one jacket they identified a microscopic particle said to be consistent with firearms discharge residue. At first glance, it appeared significant. If the particle had originated from a gun being fired, it could potentially place Barry George much closer to the murder than he claimed. For detectives, it was an important breakthrough. For critics, it would later become one of the most controversial pieces of evidence ever presented in a British murder trial. The problem was its size. The particle was tiny, almost microscopic. Questions quickly emerged about how it had arrived there. Could it only have come from a firearm? Could it have been transferred indirectly? Could it have been present for reasons entirely unrelated to murder? Those questions would become enormously important later. At the time, however, investigators believed they were moving closer to solving one of the country's most notorious crimes. As the inquiry gathered momentum, Barry George found himself under increasing scrutiny. Newspaper coverage intensified, television crews followed developments closely, the public began hearing his name. Many assumed detectives must possess compelling evidence. After all, this was one of Britain's biggest murder investigations. Surely an arrest would only be made if the case was strong. But murder investigations and murder convictions are not always the same thing. Detectives only need sufficient grounds to arrest a suspect. Convincing 12 jurors beyond reasonable doubt is a different challenge entirely. In May 2000, more than a year after Jill Dando's death, Barry George was arrested and charged with murder. The announcement dominated headlines. For many people, it appeared the mystery was finally nearing its conclusion. A suspect had been identified. A prosecution was being prepared. The public expected a trial. What they didn't yet realise was that the evidence would divide opinion almost from the moment it was presented. Some believed the police had found their man. Others feared investigators had become so determined to solve the case that they had begun building a theory around a suspect rather than a suspect around the evidence. Those doubts would only grow louder once the trial began. And in the courtroom, every piece of the prosecution's case would be tested. By the time Barry George's trial began in 2001, public interest in the case was immense. More than 2 years had passed since Jill Dando was killed. The shock that followed her murder had never really faded. The public wanted answers. Many hoped the trial would finally provide them. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors set out to convince the jury that Barry George was the man who had waited for Jill Dando outside her home and shot her at close range. The challenge facing them was obvious. There was no confession, no murder weapon, no DNA linking Barry George to the scene, no fingerprint placing him on the path outside Jill Dando's front door. The prosecution case relied largely on a combination of circumstantial evidence and forensic findings. At its centre sat the tiny particle discovered in Barry George's coat pocket. Jurors heard evidence suggesting it was consistent with firearm discharge residue. The prosecution argued that this was a significant finding. They also pointed to George's interest in weapons, his behaviour, and the aspects of his background that they believed strengthened their case. Taken individually, none of these points proved murder. The prosecution's argument was that when viewed together, they painted a compelling picture. The defence saw things very differently. They argued that the case was built on assumptions rather than proof. The firearms residue evidence was challenged. Witness evidence was questioned. The absence of direct forensic links was highlighted repeatedly. Throughout the trial, one issue seemed to hang over everything else. Could a man be convicted of one of Britain's most notorious murders without any clear evidence placing him at the scene? For the jury, it was a difficult question. Court cases are rarely as simple as they appear from newspaper headlines. Jurors hear weeks of testimony, experts disagree, witnesses are challenged, small details can take on enormous significance. After hearing the evidence, the jury retired to consider its verdict. Across the country, journalists waited. So did Jill Dando's family. So did Barry George. Then the decision arrived. Guilty. Barry George was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. For many people, the verdict brought relief. At last, there appeared to be an answer. One of Britain's most famous unsolved murders had been solved. The headlines reflected that belief. The killer had been identified. Justice had been delivered. The case was over. At least that was how it appeared. Yet even as the verdict was being reported, doubts were already beginning to surface. Some legal observers questioned the strength of the evidence. Others wondered whether the prosecution had truly proved its case beyond reasonable doubt. A number of journalists who had followed the trial closely were left uneasy. Not because they could say Barry George was innocent. They couldn't. But neither could they point to a piece of evidence that conclusively demonstrated he was guilty. The debate continued long after the courtroom had emptied. Supporters of the conviction argued that juries see and hear far more than the public. Critics argued that the case contained troubling weaknesses. Years later, those concerns were become impossible to ignore, because the conviction that many believed had finally brought closure to the Jill Dando case was about to come under intense scrutiny. And when experts began re-examining the evidence, the foundations of the entire prosecution would start to crack. The man convicted of murdering Jill Dando was heading to prison, but the story was far from over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. For Jill Dando's family, the guilty verdict had appeared to bring an end to a long and painful chapter. For Barry George, it marked the beginning of years behind bars, and for much of the public, the case seemed settled. A suspect had been identified, a jury had reached a decision, the justice system had spoken. But beneath the surface, concerns about the conviction refused to disappear. As the years passed, legal teams continued examining the evidence that had secured Barry George's conviction. Attention repeatedly returned to the same issue, the microscopic particle found inside his coat pocket. At trial, it had been presented as potentially significant evidence linking him to the discharge of a firearm. Yet as forensic science developed and the evidence came under further scrutiny, questions began to grow louder. How reliable was the finding? How certain could experts really be about its origin? And perhaps most importantly, should it have carried the weight it did during the trial? These were not minor technicalities. The entire prosecution case had relied heavily on a relatively small amount of forensic evidence. If confidence in that evidence weakened, confidence in the conviction weakened with it. By the mid-2000s, the case was attracting renewed attention. Legal experts, journalists and campaigners began re-examining the details. What they found reignited debate that many had assumed was over. In 2007, the Court of Appeal reviewed the conviction. The outcome stunned many observers. The court ruled that important questions existed regarding the firearms residue evidence. As a result, Barry George's conviction was quashed. After more than 6 years in prison, the man convicted of murdering Jill Dando was no longer legally considered guilty of the crime. The decision made headlines across Britain. For supporters of George, it was vindication. For others, it was deeply unsettling. The conviction that had supposedly solved the case had suddenly disappeared. Yet the court had not declared Barry George innocent. That distinction is important. The appeal court's role was not to determine who killed Jill Dando. Its role was to decide whether the conviction remained safe. The judges concluded it did not. A retrial was ordered, and so, nearly a decade after Jill Dando's death, the case returned to court. The retrial took place in 2008. This time the prosecution faced a far more difficult task. The evidential landscape had changed dramatically. Without the same weight being placed on the firearms residue particle, the case looked very different. Jurors again heard arguments from both sides. Once again they were asked to examine one of Britain's most famous murder investigations, but this time the outcome would be very different. After deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. Barry George was acquitted. After 8 years in prison, he walked free. The reaction was immediate. Some people believed a grave miscarriage of justice had finally been corrected. Others remained convinced that police had arrested the right man, but had simply failed to meet the legal standard required for conviction. The truth was that nobody emerged from the process entirely satisfied. Not the investigators, not the public, and certainly not Jill Dando's family. Because the acquittal created a problem that nobody could avoid. If Barry George was not the killer, then who was? The case had effectively been reset. The investigation found itself standing in almost the same position it had occupied before the arrest. There was still no murder weapon, still no identified killer, still no proven motive. And now, there was no conviction. The mystery that had appeared solved in 2001 was alive again. In fact, some would argue it was more confusing than ever. The years that followed saw investigators continue to assess information and review evidence. Fresh theories emerged, old theories refused to disappear, journalists revisited the case, documentaries explored competing explanations, former detectives voiced opinions, armchair investigators filled internet forums. Everyone seemed to have a theory. Almost nobody could prove one. And this is where the Jill Dando story begins to change. Up to this point, we've been dealing largely with facts. A murder, an investigation, an arrest, a conviction, an acquittal. From here onwards, the ground becomes far less certain. Because once the official answer disappeared, a collection of rival explanations rushed in to fill the void. Some were plausible, some were extraordinary, some bordered on conspiracy. All of them shared one thing in common: none have ever been proven. Before we explore them, it's important to be clear. The next part of this story deals with theories, possibilities, and speculation. Interesting speculation, sometimes compelling speculation, but speculation nonetheless. And among all the theories that emerged after Barry George walked free, one stood out above the rest. A theory involving war, politics, intelligence services, and events unfolding hundreds of miles away from a quiet street in Fulham. Before we continue, it's important to draw a clear line between fact and theory. Everything in this chapter falls into the category of speculation. Some of it has been discussed by journalists, former investigators, and intelligence sources over the years. Some of it has been reported in newspapers and documentaries. None of it has ever been proven in court. None of it has been established as the official explanation for Jill Dando's murder. With that said, this theory has endured for more than 2 decades and remains one of the most discussed explanations for what happened on Gowan Avenue. To understand it, we need to leave London behind for a moment and travel to the Balkans. In the spring of 1999, Europe was watching a conflict unfold in Kosovo. Ethnic tensions, violence and military intervention had placed the region at the centre of international attention. In March 1999, NATO began a bombing campaign against what was then the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, under the leadership of Slobodan Milosevic. Night after night, television viewers across the world watched footage of explosions, military targets, and damaged infrastructure. The campaign was controversial. Supporters argued it was necessary to prevent further atrocities. Critics argued it caused civilian casualties and widened the conflict. Across Serbia, anger towards NATO countries was intense. Britain was one of the nations participating in the operation, and it is here that the theory begins. Jill Dando was murdered on the 26th of April 1999, just weeks after the NATO bombing campaign had begun. For some observers, that timing appeared significant. The theory suggests that Jill may have been selected as a symbolic target, not because of anything she personally did, not because of her private life, but because she represented Britain. More specifically, because she represented British broadcasting. According to supporters of the theory, an attack on somebody as recognisable as Jill Dando would send a message far beyond the individual victim. It would generate international headlines, it would create fear, and it would demonstrate that retaliation could reach the streets of London. Over the years, reports emerged claiming that intelligence agencies had examined the possibility. Former detectives and journalists had spoken publicly about information suggesting the theory was taken seriously within certain circles. There have always been claims that Serbian individuals were investigated as potential suspects. However, the public evidence supporting those claims remains limited. And this is where the theory encounters its first major obstacle. Motive is not the same as proof. Even if somebody had wanted to carry out an act of retaliation, investigators would still need evidence connecting specific individuals to the crime. That evidence has never emerged publicly. The second problem concerns the victim herself. If the intention was to strike a symbolic target, why Jill Dando? There were politicians, military figures, government ministers, senior officials, people directly involved in decision making. Jill Dando occupied none of those positions. Supporters of the theory argue that her public profile made her attractive as a target. Critics argue that she makes little sense when compared with other potential choices. Then there is the question of how the murder was carried out. Those who favour the Serbian theory often point to the nature of the attack itself. A single shot, close range, a swift escape, very little evidence left behind. To them it resembles the work of somebody with planning, discipline and experience. Skeptics respond that appearances can be misleading. Professional assassinations often leave clear intelligence trails, communications, financial links or identifiable suspects. None of those have ever been publicly produced in the Dando case. As the years passed, the theory took on a life of its own. Books discussed about it, documentaries explored it, former officers offered opinions, journalists revisited it repeatedly. For some people, it remains the explanation that best fits the circumstances. For others, it is little more than an intriguing possibility, unsupported by hard evidence. The reality is that nobody outside the investigation can say with certainty how seriously detectives regarded the theory behind closed doors. What we do know is that it was never proven. No individual was convicted, no public evidence definitively established a Serbian connection, and so, like every major theory in the Jill Dando case, it remains suspended between possibility and proof. Interesting, plausible to some, unconvincing to others, but ultimately unresolved. Yet if the Serbian theory asks whether Jill became an unintended casualty of international events, the next theory takes us in a completely different direction. Back to the programme that made her famous, back to the criminals she helped expose to millions of viewers, and back to a question that has lingered since the day she was killed. Did somebody hold a grudge against the face of Crimewatch? Of all the theories surrounding Jill Dando's murder, this may be the one that feels most instinctively believable. It doesn't require international politics, it doesn't rely on intelligence agencies, it doesn't involve shadowy foreign operatives. Instead, it asks a far simpler question. What if someone held a grudge? For years, Jill Dando had been one of the public faces of Crimewatch. The programme occupied a unique place in British television. Each episode brought viewers face to face with unsolved crimes. Wanted suspects were highlighted. Reconstructions recreated violent offences. Appeals were made directly to the public. And it worked. Crimewatch generated thousands of calls over the years. Fugitives were identified. Investigations received fresh leads. Arrests followed. The programme became an important tool for police forces across the country. For victims and their families, it often represented hope. For criminals, it could represent something very different. Exposure, humiliation, the sudden realisation that millions of people were now looking at your face, looking at your car, looking at your movements, looking for you. It's not difficult to understand why this theory gained traction. The public could immediately imagine a dangerous offender developing a hatred towards the programme. A hatred that eventually became focused on one of its most recognisable presenters. And because Crimewatch dealt with serious criminals, the pool of potential suspects appeared enormous. Over the years, supporters of the theory have suggested several possibilities. Perhaps a fugitive blamed the programme for an arrest. Perhaps a criminal felt publicly shamed. Perhaps somebody with a history of violence became fixated on Jill herself after seeing her regularly associated with police appeals. The theory has obvious appeal because it creates a clear motive. Revenge. Simple, understandable, human. Yet when investigators looked for evidence, the picture became much less straightforward. One important fact is often overlooked. Crimewatch presenters did not personally investigate crimes. They didn't make arrests. They didn't decide who appeared on the programme. They were presenters. Visible certainly, recognisable absolutely, but not the people actually responsible for bringing offenders to justice. If a criminal wanted revenge against those directly involved in a case, there were usually many other targets available. Detectives, witnesses, informants, victims, prosecutors. So why focus on Jill Dando? Supporters of the theory argue that visibility matters. A television presenter becomes the public face of an organisation, whether they chose to or not. Millions of viewers associated Crimewatch with Jill. In that sense, she became a symbol. The counter-argument is equally powerful. Symbols are useful in stories. Real killers often operate for far more personal reasons. Another difficulty is the sheer lack of evidence pointing towards any specific individual. During the investigation, police examined numerous possibilities connected to Crimewatch. Potential grudges were explored, names were checked, information was assessed. Yet no suspect emerged with evidence strong enough to explain the murder. No clear trail led from a featured criminal to Gowan Avenue. No convincing link was established. The theory also struggles with the practical realities of the attack. If this was revenge, it was an extraordinarily disciplined act of revenge. The killer approached in daylight, carried out the shooting quickly, left very little evidence behind, and disappeared. The level of control has led some observers to believe the offender possessed significant planning ability. Others point out that successful crimes can sometimes create an illusion of sophistication. We often judge offenders by the outcome rather than the process. A criminal doesn't need military training to get lucky, nor does a crime need to be professionally organised to appear professional afterwards. The longer the case has remained unsolved, the more room there has been for theories like this to grow. And that's one of the recurring themes of the Jill Dando mystery. Every theory explains some aspects of the case, none explain all of them. The Crimewatch theory provides a potential motive, but it lacks a proven suspect. The Serbian theory offers a broader context, but lacks direct evidence. Each solves one piece of the puzzle, while leaving several others untouched. And that brings us to perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all. A theory that doesn't require organised crime, international conflict, or revenge. A theory that appears again and again whenever a public figure is murdered. The possibility that somebody became obsessed. Not with Crimewatch, not with politics, not with a cause, but with Jill Dando herself. When a famous person is murdered, one possibility is almost always considered. Obsession. History is filled with examples of public figures being targeted by people who felt a connection that never really existed. Actors, musicians, TV presenters, politicians. The details change, but the pattern is often familiar. An admirer becomes fascinated. The fascination deepens. Over time, admiration can become entitlement, resentment, or fixation. In the most extreme cases, fantasy collides with reality. Because of Jill Dando's profile, detectives explored this possibility from an early stage. It wasn't difficult to understand why. She appeared regularly on national television. Millions of people knew who she was. Many felt as though they knew her personally. Of course they didn't. They knew the version of Jill that appeared on screen. The friendly presenter, the reassuring face, the trusted broadcaster. Yet for a small number of individuals, that distinction can become blurred. Investigators examine reports of unwanted attention Jill had received over the years. Like many public figures, she had attracted admirers. Most were harmless, some were unusual. The challenge facing detectives was determining whether any of them posed a genuine threat. As officers worked through letters, communications, and previous incidents, they searched for signs of escalation, the kind of behaviour often seen before an attack. Threats, fixation, repeated attempts to make contact, obsessive patterns, anything that might point towards a suspect. What they found has never produced a definitive answer. And yet, the theory continues to attract support, partly because it removes the need for a complicated motive. No international conspiracy, no organised crime connection, no elaborate revenge plot, just one individual whose behaviour spiralled into violence. Supporters of the theory often point to the fact that Jill appears to have been specifically targeted. Nothing was stolen, the attack lasted only moments, the killer's objective seems to have been clear from the outset. That kind of focus is consistent with crimes committed by fixated offenders. But there are problems with the theory as well. Significant problems. The biggest concern, the nature of the attack itself. Many stalkers are driven by emotion. Their actions can be impulsive, chaotic, messy. The murder of Jill Dando appears remarkably controlled. The offender arrived, completed the attack, escaped, and left investigators with very little to work with. That doesn't rule out a stalker, but it does force an important question. If the killer was acting out of obsession, how did they carry out such an effective attack? Then there is the issue of opportunity. Supporters of the theory suggest the killer may have monitored Jill's movements over time. Perhaps they knew where she lived. Perhaps they understood her routine. Perhaps they recognised an opportunity when she arrived home that morning. Critics argue that the timing appears almost too precise. The attack occurred during a brief window, one that required either exceptional luck or prior knowledge. Again, there are no definitive answers, only possibilities. And that is the frustrating reality of the Jill Dando case. Every road eventually reaches the same destination: uncertainty. Over the years, journalists, former detectives, and independent researchers have examined this theory repeatedly. Some consider it the most likely explanation. Others believe it fails to account for key aspects of the crime. Neither side has managed to prove its case. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that the stalker theory remains possible. Not proven, not disproven, simply possible. And after more than 2 decades, possibility is often the closest thing this case offers. Yet there is another question worth asking, one that moves the focus away from suspects and back towards the investigation itself. Because what if the greatest mystery isn't who killed Jill Dando? What if the greatest mystery is how one of the largest murder investigations in British history failed to deliver a clear answer? To explore that, we need to examine the inquiry itself, the decisions that were made, the pressure detectives faced, and the criticism that followed. Because for some observers, the story of Jill Dando's murder is not just about an unidentified killer. It's about whether the search for justice lost its way. By the time Barry George was acquitted in 2008, the Jill Dando investigation had been transformed. What had once appeared to be a solved case was now an unsolved one again. The certainty that followed the conviction had vanished. In its place came doubt, not just about the identity of the killer, but about the investigation itself. Whenever a major case remains unsolved, criticism is inevitable. Detectives are questioned, decisions are scrutinised, missed opportunities are examined. The longer a mystery survives, the more people begin asking whether the truth was overlooked somewhere along the way. The murder of Jill Dando is no exception. To understand the criticism, it's important to remember the circumstances facing investigators in 1999. This was not an ordinary murder inquiry. The victim was one of the most recognisable people in Britain. The case dominated headlines for months. Every development became national news. Every setback attracted attention. Every delay generated fresh speculation. Pressure came from every direction. The public wanted answers. The media wanted answers. Politicians wanted answers. And detectives knew that every decision would be examined under an unforgiving spotlight. Former investigators have spoken about the extraordinary scale of the inquiry. Hundreds of officers, thousands of witness statements, an enormous volume of information. The challenge was not finding leads. The challenge was deciding which leads mattered. With hindsight, that is where many of the criticisms begin. Some observers believe investigators became too focused on certain theories while other possibilities received less attention. Others argue that this is simply the reality of major investigations. Police cannot pursue every lead with equal intensity. Resources must be directed somewhere. Decisions have to be made. The difficulty is that those decisions are judged very differently when a case remains unsolved. Then there is the question that continues to divide opinion: Barry George. For some people, his acquittal represents a serious miscarriage of justice. They argue that an innocent man spent years in prison, while the real killer remained free. For others, the situation is less clear-cut. They point out that an acquittal does not identify an alternative suspect, nor does it explain who committed the murder. These competing interpretations have fueled debate for years, and perhaps that debate tells us something important. People are uncomfortable with uncertainty. We like conclusions. We prefer stories that end with an arrest, a trial, and a verdict. The Jill Dando case refuses to provide that comfort. Instead, it leaves us with unanswered questions. Questions that become more difficult with each passing year. Witness memories fade. Potential evidence disappears. People move away. People die. Opportunities that existed in 1999 cannot be recreated decades later. Time itself becomes an obstacle, and yet the case continues to fascinate, partly because of who Jill Dando was, partly because of how she died, but also because it exposes a difficult reality about criminal investigations. Even the largest inquiries don't always produce certainty. Even vast resources cannot guarantee answers. Even when detectives do everything they believe is right, the truth can remain out of reach. That isn't a comfortable conclusion, but it may be an honest one. Somewhere, hidden beneath years of headlines, theories, documentaries and debate, there is a simple truth about what happened on Gowan Avenue. One sequence of events, one killer, one motive. The challenge is that nobody has ever been able to prove what that truth is. And perhaps that is why the case still captures the public imagination more than 25 years later. Not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. Because after all the investigations, all the court hearings, and all the theories, the central mystery remains exactly where it began, standing outside a front door in Fulham, waiting for an answer that may never come. But before we close the file completely, there is one final question to consider. When all the theories are laid side by side, which explanation comes closest to fitting the known facts? And why has Britain never been able to move beyond this case? More than 25 years have passed since Jill Dando was shot outside her home on Gowan Avenue. A generation has grown up since that spring morning in 1999. Governments have come and gone. Technology has transformed the way crimes are investigated. Entire news cycles have been forgotten. Yet the question at the heart of this case remains exactly where it was on the day of the murder. Who killed Jill Dando? Throughout this episode, we've examined the facts, followed the investigation, and explored the theories that continue to surround the case. The truth is that each explanation appears convincing until it encounters its own problems. The Serbian theory offers a possible motive, tied to world events unfolding at the time. It helps explain why such a high-profile figure might have been selected. But after all these years, no public evidence has emerged that conclusively links the murder to a Serbian operation or any foreign intelligence involvement. The Crimewatch theory appeals because it feels personal. The programme dealt with dangerous offenders. It's easy to imagine resentment turning into revenge. Yet no clear suspect has ever emerged from that line of inquiry. No direct connection has been established between a featured criminal and the attack on Gowan Avenue. The stalker theory requires the fewest moving parts. One offender, one obsession, one victim. In many ways it is the simplest explanation. but simplicity alone doesn't make something true. Questions remain about the planning, timing, and execution of the murder, questions that continue to divide opinion. And then there is Barry George, the man who spent 8 years in prison for a crime he was ultimately acquitted of. Some listeners may believe he was the victim of a grave miscarriage of justice. Others may feel that his acquittal answered only one question and left many others unresolved. What can't be disputed is that his conviction no longer stands. Legally, he is not the killer of Jill Dando. The case remains unsolved. Perhaps that's why this story continues to grip public imagination. Most murder cases eventually settle into a clear narrative. A suspect identified, evidence is presented, a verdict is reached. People may disagree about details, but the broad outline becomes accepted. The Jill Dando case never achieved that. Instead, it became something rarer, a national mystery, one where every answer generates new questions, one where certainty remains frustratingly out of reach. Somewhere in the years that followed the murder, the investigation became larger than the crime itself. Theories multiplied, books were written, documentaries were produced, former detectives gave interviews, journalists revisited old evidence, the public debated possibilities, yet beneath all of that sits a far simpler reality. On the morning of the 26th of April 1999, a woman returned home. She walked towards her front door. Within moments, she was dead. Everything else comes afterwards. The headlines, the suspect, the court cases, the arguments, the speculation, the endless search for an explanation. Perhaps somebody somewhere knows exactly what happened. Perhaps there is a person who has carried that knowledge for decades, a witness who never came forward, an accomplice who remained silent, or even the killer themselves. If that person exists, they have watched the years pass while one of Britain's most famous unsolved murders remained unsolved. And that may be the most unsettling thought of all. Not that the truth is hidden, but that the truth could be known by someone who has simply chosen never to speak. For Jill Dando's family, the absence of certainty has been its own form of punishment. No verdict can change that. No theory can change that. No documentary or podcast can change that. All these years later, they're still left with the same loss that began this story. The loss of a daughter, a sister, a fiancé, a friend. And for the rest of us, the case remains a reminder that even in an age of forensic science, surveillance cameras, and massive police resources, some mysteries endure. Not because nobody tried to solve them, but because the final piece of the puzzle was never found, or perhaps never recognised. And so we leave Gowan Avenue much as we found it, a quiet street, an ordinary front door, a moment in time that changed countless lives, a murder that shocked a nation, and a question that still has no proven answer. Who killed Jill Dando? That is something Britain is still waiting to discover. Thank you for listening to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider following, rating and sharing the podcast. You can also support the show through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. Until next time, take care of yourselves, look after each other, and remember, sometimes the most extraordinary secrets are hidden in the places we pass every day.